To improve is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. To me, this really describes the ongoing struggle of security. We all want to be perfectly secure, but to some degree, perfection and security are both unachievable goals. And so the best we can do is to continue to change and adapt, and maybe in a way that is, perfection. And so today we're going to be talking about a big change, at least for anyone who works in payments or, payment acceptance, and that's PCI DSS 4.0. It's here. Now what? So before we dig in, who knows what PCI is? Who doesn't know what PCI is? Who pretends not to know what PCI is so that they don't have to work on PCI assessments? Well, I'm Kyle Hinterberg, and 11 or 12 years ago, I had no idea what PCI was. I was a sysadmin at an e-commerce company, and one year a bank came to us and said, hey, you have to do PCI right, or you're going to face the consequences. And so they said part of this is someone has to go become a PCI ISA, or an internal security assessor. And so that was me. I volunteered. I was new to security, thought, I'll do that. And I volunteered, and now here I am. And so let that be a lesson to anyone volunteering for anything. I was an ISA for a while. I eventually changed over to the other side of the table, became a consultant and a QSA, or a qualified security assessor, which just basically means I can do PCI assessments for other people. But all that's kind of boring, so if you want to remember two things about me, I got awesome dogs. That's Ace, Oakley, and Apollo. This is the newest member of the pack, Artemis. And I'm a QSA, but I'm not your QSA. So if you have any questions, I'd love to talk through them, but ultimately your compliance is really going to be determined by you, your QSA, and your bank. So for what PCI is, it's the payment card industry. A number of years ago, the major credit card brands, they got together, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, and JCB. They decided they wanted rules for how to govern credit card and credit card information. And so they created the PCI Security Standards Council, or PCI SSC. That Security Standards Council has made a number of standards over the years, but the main one is the DSS, or the Data Security Standard. And basically, it's the rule book for how you have to handle credit card information, specifically if you're a merchant or a service provider. And the DSS, it's went through a number of revisions over the years. It came out back in 2004. Since then, it moved up in 2018 when the most current version that most people are following, 3.2.1, came out. But last year was the big shakeup. 4.0 was released. But whenever a new standard comes out, you're not forced to jump right over to it, so you do have some transition time, which is where most people are still on that version 3.2.1. Because with version 4, all the requirements were renumbered, reorganized, and updated, and it was a big number change. And so as you can see here, this is kind of the transition period. People have until April 1st, 2024. That's the deadline. By April 1st, 2024, that's when everyone's going to have to start assessing against version 4. But even at that point, you still have a bit of a transition period because there's a number of new requirements, 64 new requirements that got introduced in this standard. And so those new requirements, the vast majority, aren't going to be required until April 1st, 2025. Until then, they're just best practices. So whenever you're thinking about PCI DSS version 4, those are the two big dates to keep in mind. April 1st, 2024, that's when you need to assess against it. April 1st, 2025, that's when all the requirements are going to be in effect. So what exactly is new in 4.0? And the honest truth is a whole lot. There's more than we can talk about in the time we have today, so we're just going to hit some of the highlights and then talk about some of those big ticket items, the things that you should be working on well ahead of 2025 if you want to have a hope of being compliant when you need to be. So to talk through some of the highlights, some of my favorite points. One of them is, if you look at the current version and past versions of the DSS, it talked about firewall rule sets, router rule sets, but a lot of people got confused on these because nowadays in cloud environments and other, software network controls, it made firewalls a little bit outdated. So that term's been ditched. Now it's the network security controls. That the requirements themselves are basically the same as they have been. It's just network security controls instead of firewalls or routers. The next one here, requirement 5.3.2, now allows you to use anti-malware to perform continuous behavioral checks instead of doing scans. In the past you had to do regular scans. Now you can do more modern EDR without having to have a compensating control to allow you to get by with that. Requirement 8.2.2, this one allows you to be compliant even when you're using a shared account. And so really what this one does for you is everyone here has break glass accounts on network environment. You always are going to have your break glass admin account for your firewall. Those are non-compliant. There's no real way around it. Those are technically non-compliant even though everyone does it. This allows an option to finally make that compliant because they realize everyone does it regardless of what they want you to do. 8.3.9 is probably going to be most people's favorite. It allows you to get rid of password rotation. Historically, PCI always wants you to do that 90-day password rotation. Now, if you're using a password as part of an MFA solution, or if you're doing posture analysis of your accounts to try to figure out if there's something, all of a sudden Bob is logging in from Russia, those types of things, if you employ those types of security solutions, you can ditch password rotation. 11.4.4 is probably my favorite. It allows you to determine what penetration test vulnerabilities you need to remediate. If you look at the current version 3.2.1, it just says anything exploitable needs to be remediated, which is kind of vague. But now in 11.4.4, the new requirement in 4.0, it says that companies just need to follow their own risk remediation standards. So they determine, hey, this is a high, we need to fix it in 90 days, et cetera. As long as they're doing that, they're compliant. And last but not least, enterprise risk assessments are gone. This has always been one that's been a little bit tricky because the scope of what you actually had to cover in these risk assessments was never quite clear. And so now there is no longer an enterprise risk assessment requirement. There's just certain requirements have smaller, specific, targeted risk analyses that need to be performed. So anyone who's familiar with 4.0 might say, hey, why didn't you have the customized approach in that list? And it's because, in my opinion, the customized approach is getting overhyped. It's cool, it's nice, but at the end of the day, I don't really see a lot of people are going to use it, and I don't really think a lot of people should use it. And so if you're not familiar, in PCI 4.0, you're going to have two options whenever you're assessing most requirements. Either you can take the defined approach, which is just following the rule as it's written, doing what the data security standard says, and that's how you're implementing that control. Or you can make your own control, completely custom. You can write it up yourself, say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and that's how we're going to meet this objective. And so each requirement that allows this will have an objective, and you can choose to meet that however you like. And as long as it's valid and your assessor allows you to do it, that's fine. But again, this isn't going to be like a quick win or a way to cheat the system. It's going to require more work, and generally speaking, it's not really something people should worry about. To kind of explain it, if you have the objective that you need to get to work, most people are going to follow the defined way to do that, and they're going to drive to work. But some people might own a jetpack, and so they're going to fly to work. And that covers them, and they're still meeting that objective. But again, if you're an organization, you're looking through these controls, you should just follow the defined approach unless you're reading through one and you realize you have that metaphorical jetpack. And one other thing to keep in mind with these is that the compensating control, or the idea of a compensating control, hasn't went away. That still exists. And for anyone who isn't familiar, a compensating control is what you can do if you get to a requirement that you need to follow and you have a legitimate business or technical constraint that prevents you from meeting that control. You can implement a compensating control, basically documenting some mitigating factors. You can still do that, and it's different from a custom control. Compensating control should only be used when you have a legitimate business or technical constraint. Customized approaches, custom controls, should be used when you have a new or better way to do things. And as a last note on them, if you do take that custom approach, you can't use a compensating control on your custom approach. If you went through the trouble of making your own requirement, you should be able to follow it without any help. So to shift gears, now we'll talk through some of those items that are more of those big ticket ones, the ones that I'd recommend organizations to start working on right away, so that way they're in place in time. And the first one is, scope reviews. Historically, organizations have not had a hard and fast requirement to do a PCI scope review. It's always been assumed there are requirements for things like diagrams and inventories, but there wasn't a specific requirement for scoping, but that's no longer the case. Now you are going to have to perform your own scope review, document your scope, and that'll be evidence that you'll need to provide to your QSA when you do your first 4.0 assessment. This is one of those new requirements that comes into play immediately. So when you do your first 4.0 assessment, your QSA will expect to be reviewing your scope validation documentation. And if you don't have it or it's insufficient, that potentially opens you up to non-compliance. And this is something you need to do at least annually, unless you're a service provider. In that case, you have to do it twice a year. And there's even additional requirements that are having, really taking a harder look at some of the documentation and really making sure you're understanding your own environment. Doing things like forcing you to look at your keys and certificates, hardware and software, user and system accounts, Cypher suites, really documenting a lot of the different controls in your environment, so that way, again, you actually know what's there, not just relying on your QSA to tell you what's in scope. As a note on timing, this is going to be the only one we're talking about that comes into effect immediately. The other new requirements that come into effect immediately are really primarily policy and procedure updates. So the rest of the ones we're going to jump into here are all ones that will be best practices until April 1st, 2025. Anyone who's familiar with PCI will see that they, consistently have been pushing more MFA, trying to get MFA all over the place. And so this is just continuing that. Now you are going to have to use MFA whenever you're signing into a CDE system. And the CDE, that's the cardholder data environment. Really, a CDE system is anything that stores, processes, or transmits credit card information, or any system that isn't segmented from a system that stores, processes, or transmits. So this means even if you're sitting in your corporate office on your corporate workstation, if you go to sign into a CDE system, you'll have to use MFA for that authentication. And there still is the requirement that you need to use MFA for remote access. So if you are sitting at home and you VPN in and then sign into a CDE system, when you do the VPN, you'll have to authenticate with MFA. Then when you do the access into that CDE system, you'll have to use MFA again. They can use the same MFA solution, both could be Okta or Duo or whatever, but you need separate hits for both steps. Back in 2015, we had the first EMV liability shift, and what that meant is it really was pushing organizations to start accepting chipped credit cards. And nowadays, basically all the cards that you use have chips in them, and what that has done is made it a lot harder for people to steal credit card information during face-to-face transactions. But the downside to that is that it's pushed a lot of those malicious people online. And if you've been paying attention to the news, in the last several years, there's been a lot of breaches due to, mage cart style attacks, people siphoning data off of payment pages. And that was one of the major pushes in 4.0 is to start locking down payment pages. So there's some specific requirements around that, as you can see here, the one looking at payment page scripts, making sure that you know all the scripts that are running on your payment pages, you can justify why they're there, you can validate their integrity and make sure they're not changing when you don't expect them to change. This is one where my recommendation to everyone is just to look at all the scripts, and if you don't need a script running on your payment page, get rid of it. You might have to fight with your marketing department, but odds are it's not that big of a deal to pull a script off of your payment page. You can keep them everywhere else, just don't have them where credit card information's coming in. And you're also going to have to put in change and tamper detection mechanisms. Again, this is looking at the headers and the HTTP content, kind of making sure that what is getting presented to someone entering credit card information is exactly what you expect it to be, and that it's not being modified unless you want it to be modified. Requirement 541, in my opinion, is kind of a radical shift for the DSS because it's requiring you to put in anti-phishing protections on your email solution or however you're receiving emails. And the reason this is a little bit different for PCI is that email solution isn't generally going to be in scope. Odds are your emails aren't in scope for PCI or you're probably doing something wrong. And so the requirement even stipulates that just because they're making you do this does not bring your email solution into scope, but you are going to have something, a lot of people might have like a Mimecast or a Proofpoint or something protecting your users already. And that's what they're looking for, because similar to the issue with those mage card attacks, they realize one of the biggest ways that people get into an organization is through phishing. And even if you have segmentation in place, odds are if someone breaks into your network, it's just a matter of time until they find, your CDE, get access to your sensitive information. in the, the current version kind of, or the last version of 3.2.1, requirement 6.6 was one of the few that gave you kind of an either or. You could either do web application vulnerability assessments, or you could implement a web application firewall, a WAF or something similar to that. Going forward with 4.0, this option is being removed and you're going to have to implement a WAF. That's the only option you'll have. Web application security assessments are still a great thing, still something you should consider to keep in your, your development and your vulnerability management programs, but you are going to have a WAF. This is where the SSC has just determined that you need that 24/7 protection. And in a somewhat similar situation, organizations have always had to perform daily log reviews. But the issue was it was never really called out how they had to do those reviews, and so it's always been technically compliant to perform manual log reviews. But anyone who's ever played with logs knows that if you have like more than 2 systems, you can't actually do manual log reviews. It just becomes completely unfeasible. And so now in 4.0, you are going to have some type of an automated solution, something like a SIM that is looking at all those logs and generating actionable alerts, so that way people can actually do this and let those tools do what they're meant to do. Service providers, in the PCI world, organizations that are helping merchants, those service providers have had to look at critical security system control failures for a while, had to detect them and alert on them, but now merchants are going to have to do this too. So basically any organization that has to, be compliant has to look at these critical security controls and then determine if they failed. And this is one that, if you think about it, it can be a little bit weird, what does it really mean? So the easiest way to think about it is just determine what your critical security control systems are. Things like firewalls, physical access control, your anti-malware solution. And then if they failed, how would they fail, and would you have any clue that it happened? If this is something you don't really have in place from a security perspective, odds are your best bet is to talk to some of your infrastructure engineers, your system admins. They likely already have things that are monitoring for uptime, monitoring for system usage. Those are exactly the types of tools that you're going to want to use and should get you most, if not all the way there for this one. Quarterly internal scans have been something that have had to happen for a long time, but now with PCI 4.0, you are going to have to do authenticated vulnerability scans. And the honest truth is most organizations avoid these. Even though authenticated scans can provide better information, they also tend to provide a lot more findings. And so they get to be a lot more unruly to handle. So with that in mind, my recommendation is to start doing, keep doing those unauthenticated if you are, but start doing authenticated scans as well. Use those unauthenticated scans to support your compliance for the time being, and then when we get to April 1st, 2025, and you need to start doing those authenticated ones, hopefully you've already whittled down those findings and you're good to go and can continue with doing those scans. A couple notes. First of all, this is only on the internal side. External vulnerability scans, those quarterly ones, they're still required, but they have to come through an ASV, an approved scanning vendor, just the same as before. No big changes there. But the SSC has laid out strict requirements over timing. This is something where people forever have tried to fight with words like quarterly and say, hey, I ran a scan in December and another scan in January, so that covers me for 2 quarters. And that's not the way it works. So now, quarterly is being solidly defined. It means every 90 to 92 days or on the nth day of every 3rd month. And they have similar definitions for what daily means, what annual means. All of those have very hard definitions. So if looking at those requirements that have to happen on a schedule, you need to make sure you're hitting that schedule, or again, potentially face non-compliance. And so kind of to circle back to where we started, what should we do now that 4.0 is out? Start working on our scope review and validation processes, put MFA on all the things, start reviewing and securing our payment pages, protect our users from phishing emails, WAF it up, implement a SIM or a similar solution, detect and address critical security control system failures, and start performing authenticated internal vulnerability scans. Some of these items may require some big changes, but I hope you all feel at least a little motivated to trying to achieve protection through continued change. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I think I have time for a few questions if anyone has any.
Are you telling me under the current standard that anybody who processes my payment card doesn't have to do any kind of authenticated scan and they only have to fire off those bad boys every 90 days?
Yes.
Do you actually use your card anywhere?
I make sure to change it regularly. Any other questions?
How are mappings working, like with different benchmarks with some of these new requirements that they have? Is it like even a one-to-one relationship with some of these new things that PCI has come out with? Or?
To a degree, some of them are one-to-one, and like for most of the requirements that stayed the same, they're renumbered, but it's still there. Like right now, if you're compliant to the current version, you're going to be compliant for the most part when 4.0 comes out, other than some of these new ones like doing the authenticated scans. And then, like the current requirement is still in the DSS, and that one will just be phased out. So I would expect, come 2025, there'll be version 4.1 that'll just get rid of those and streamline it a little bit more. Any other questions?
Have EMV chips as well as TAP technology actually kind of netted most of the physical risk out of essentially the payment card industry?
To a good degree, it still does exist, and that's where now there's, like there used to be skimmers, now it's more so shimmers, and so that still exists, and it's much more difficult, but it's not impossible. And I know that, like now there's EMV 2.0 and, moving that up, that is making it harder to do that. And so it's removed it a lot, but that's where even today, half the gas stations you go to, they're still not EMV compliant. The majority of gas pumps out there still have to use swipe cards because it's just too expensive for them to bother making everything IP. That's what they have to, right now, if you don't know, most gas pumps still use serial connections, and that's where they just use the old swipes. And to be able to get EMV compliant, they have to run, IP connections out to them and completely redo their networking, which is where most gas pumps still run on non-EMV technology, and that's the biggest area right now for, at least in the United States, for, theft. And that's where you find tons of skimmers. Any other questions? If not, I thank you all for your time.